Okay, so I'm here to ask the question, how do we best teach engagement? We found it to be a bit of a problem in my own practice, my own teaching, and we want to think about what we do. So what we've decided to do is put students into cross-cultural settings where they basically ask the question, what do they know and what don't they know? And so for the past 4 years at La Trobe's Bendigo campus, we've taken students to Sri Lanka to be part of a series of community engagement projects around spatial planning projects, around regional development activities, working with communities, working with students at universities over there, putting them in situations where they're not really sure what they know and what they don't know. So our idea is really that by doing that, they'll have to really reflect on what it is that they do, what engagement's about, what's actually behind the idea of asking people and listening. These have been projects which have been part of a longer series of activities that planners in Australia have been involved with in Sri Lanka since the 2004 tsunami. So since that time, there's been a number of projects funded which have really tried to say, recovering from the tsunami hasn't simply been a disaster recovery exercise, but it's also been about the institutions that have led to people being more vulnerable, thinking about land use and settlement, where people live, how that actually creates vulnerabilities for communities, how it makes people live in situations where they're actually exposed to disaster. So as part of that, I've been over there in Sri Lanka a few times, and I've taken students a number of times to try and be part of projects that are practical, be part of projects that are ongoing, where they can actually see how planners over there work, what communities expect, and for themselves, of course, to try and see what planning might be about outside of their own experience. Because we have students who come from a series of backgrounds, typically rural backgrounds, but not always. Their experience of planning is usually about exposure to Australian cities and Australian regional areas, and consequently they've got specific notions of what planning's about, what community engagement's about. And our ideas are the notion that we expose students to new and unfamiliar settings. We're asking them to deal with planning issues that they might not know really what's going on. They won't know that if they're an expert. It'll challenge their very idea of what planning should be about because they're in a different setting with different priorities. And we also ask them to collaborate with student planners in another country. We ask them to talk to communities, to talk to planners as experts, and to actually talk to other stakeholders. We find it very interesting when they go out and talk to people working in local government, people working in small, under-resourced communities to try and understand what planning might be about and how it might work. And so that's our aim. Of course, Australian students are presented with a whole heap of challenges when they arrive in Sri Lanka. And to be fair, these aren't all Australian students. Some of them are international students, but generally they're coming from very different backgrounds. They're suddenly exposed to very different priorities, very different politics, different issues about what the urban problem might be to be solved, and that's confronting. They're in unfamiliar environments where transport issues or housing issues, where urban governance generally is just done differently, where people's expectations of how to actually be engaged in those processes is done differently. So since 2009, we've been involved in projects which have taken students into what's called the central fragile areas, the uplands of the central part of Sri Lanka, where massive urbanisation and exposure to landslips and land clearing have created huge issues and challenges for urbanisation and planning. We've taken students to a large new metropolis forming in the south of the country, where trying to actually deal with development through massive urbanisation is occurring. We've taken students to the east coast, to tsunami-affected areas that were also exposed to years of conflict, where the peace and the post-tsunami era have suddenly resulted in serious issues of urbanisation and even tourism development, recreational development. And so in each instance, we've asked them to do projects which have actually required them to be involved in activities that are going on. A number of them have been AusAid-funded projects where professional planners have been involved, and our students have had a chance to be doing data collection, research, coordinating workshops, those sorts of things to actually really get to the heart of what planning can be about. In some instances, exposing them to real planning more than they're able to do very easily in Australia. Now, of course, it brings a series of challenges. There's some critical issues for them. they're asked themselves the question, what's universal about planning and what's very much contingent or contextual on the place they're in. They go in with their own understanding and knowledge. They share some of those ideas and understandings with students in Sri Lanka. But then they start to question them, very often right off the first few days, start to question what it is they know. It can be very confronting because then they suddenly realise that they don't know a lot about planning in that place. Soon they realise that they don't need to know necessarily a lot about the planning of the place, the detail of the processes, and it forces them to listen. They start to get out of the mode of thinking they've got to problem solve and into the mode of thinking they've got to learn and understand and take information from people. The idea that they might start to use that information and to let that guide their problem solving rather than trying to bring their own expertise to it. They've got to learn in situations where the normalised practices of both planning and community engagement are different. They've been exposed to Australian systems of being involved in the community. Some of those are highly institutionalised. Many of them are about what communities expect when governments sort of talk to them and how they're intended to work. So there's systems in there that are sometimes almost invisible as participants for us. They're asking the question in a sense of how much of our own community engagement is genuine, how much is perhaps just therapy or worse, by being exposed to the differences that are occurring. So just to sort of talk about some ideas, I mean, these are the situations where we've got students who are confronting very different issues of transport. They're confronting very different issues of even things like how kids get to school. What are the priorities for mobility? We're asking them to engage with people who might have significantly different practices of meeting, talking, language issues. We're asking them to deal with places with very different priorities about what makes good urban environments and what needs to be done to improve urban environments. So the lessons for us are really that the students have been forced to confront unfamiliar settings. They've had to unlearn many of the things that they assume to be normal about their practice, about their engagement, about how to be involved in planning projects in general. It's being in a cross-cultural setting has forced them to really listen. They've suddenly realised that they can't take things for granted. They can't necessarily skim over what's being said. They're actually got to go out and listen to community stakeholders, to people in government, to other students, and really do that in a genuine way to get out into people's homes in some instances. We've been doing this with people helping with translation, but largely it's about getting out into homes and talking to people, getting into communities and talking to people. Okay, and sometimes this has led us to meetings where we've had three languages going at once and required a bit of interpreting and translation in the sessions. That's been confronting for students, of course. We've been running meetings where we've had community members, local stakeholders who really haven't had a lot of knowledge about what planning is in some very remote areas as well. And so we've even been involved in the idea of introducing how, in fact, spatial planning might work in those communities. But the essential thing for me, I suppose, for our students at least, has been the idea that they've been required to set aside assumptions that they've had. They've been required to think through problems and the expectations of someone else. They've been required to set aside the idea that their own knowledge and expertise is shaped entirely by the problem solving and action they can take as planners, and rather to start to think about the way that their skills might be about listening, facilitating and interpreting what they hear. I suppose that for me is our big idea. So thanks.